Good morning, everyone. Today we have the pleasure of receiving Michèle and Ambalika. Michèle Biss is the Executive Director of the National Right to Housing Network. As an expert in economic and social rights, she has presented at several United Nations treaty body reviews and at Canadian parliamentary committees. Prior to her work at the NRHN, Michèle was the policy director and human rights lawyer at Canada Without Poverty. In 2016, she graduated from the advanced course on economic, social, and cultural rights at Abo Academy University in Finland. She has extensive professional experience working for marginalized groups, particularly women, persons with disabilities, newcomers, and Indigenous persons through casework, research, and community legal education. In her local Ottawa community, she sits on the board of directors of Ottawa Community Legal Services. She is a human rights lawyer and was called to the Ontario Bar in 2014. And Ambalika Roy is the legal education coordinator at the National Right to Housing Network, NRHN. She is a human rights lawyer with over a decade of experience working in national legal aid clinics in India, providing legal support to various equity-deserving groups. Her work has focused on access to justice and social inclusion, and she has contributed to several landmark judgments, including the recognition of the right to confidentiality for people living with HIV and the right to identify for transgender persons in India. Ambalika has worked extensively with marginalized communities, particularly women, people living with HIV, and LGBTQI individuals, and has led numerous public legal education initiatives. Before joining NRHN, she worked as the Senior Community Engagement Advisor at the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights. And thank you very much for joining us. And now, Michèle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much for that kind introduction. And thank you so much to the OCASI Accessibility Initiative for the invitation to do this work together today. Before I get started, I would like to kick us off with a land acknowledgement of my own. As noted, we're all joining from different places across Turtle Island. I myself am joining today from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, in an area protected by the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 in the area colonially known as Lavigne, Ontario. I feel a deep connection to this land. Folks might be able to see the pine trees right behind me, and I'll invite folks to, as we join this webinar, reflect, think about all of our roles in reconciliation and the systemic violations of the right to housing that are disproportionately faced by First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in this country. So if I can have the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to get us started and say hello, welcome. As was mentioned earlier, my name is Michèle Biss. I'm the Executive Director of the National Right to Housing Network. I'm joined today by my brilliant colleague, Ambalika, and we are going to spend some time today talking about the right to housing, talking about what it means in terms of accessibility and what it means for the rights of newcomers. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you so much. Okay, so before we get started, a little bit about the National Right to Housing Network. We're actually a relatively new organization. We launched in just February of 2020, and we have two goals at the National Right to Housing Network. One is to help advise our structure for Canada's legislation on the right to housing. We're going to spend a lot of time in this session talking about what we call the National Housing Strategy Act, Canada's right to housing law. And we were formed very much around this legislation just about 6 months after the legislation passed. We were formed to make sure that people in Canada know about the legislation and the really unique access to justice mechanism that is part of the legislation. And our other role is working very closely with the federal government to make sure that they take this legislation seriously. As Ambalika and I will talk about this afternoon, the right to housing is something that government in Canada has been very trepidatious around in the past, but the move to legislate the right to housing is a really important one. So currently, we have over 2,000 organizations and individuals who are committed to the meaningful implementation of the right to housing in Canada and who are part of the National Right to Housing Network. So, what are we going to be talking about in this agenda this afternoon? I'm so pleased to say that there's quite a few folks here. So, we want to make sure that we make the very best use of your time. We'd like to take some time first to talk a little bit about what is the right to housing, where does the right to housing come from. Then, we're going to talk a little bit about Canada's commitment to the right to housing in that National Housing Strategy Act. Then we'll talk a little bit about the key features of the National Housing Strategy Act and the way that it recognizes housing as a fundamental human right. Then Ambalika is going to lead us to talk about systemic housing issues. Then we're going to talk about community engagement. So, what it means for all of you to claim your right to housing. Okay, so, if you walk away with one thing this afternoon from this presentation, I want you to walk away with this idea that the right to housing is not just a rallying cry. It's not just something that we put on posters and go to protest to say. It's not just something that we say, it's not just language. But like human rights more generally, it offers a concrete set of standards that can be implemented and measured for progress. The right to housing is protected in international human rights law and covenants that Canada has signed on to. And it's important to know as well that every so often, Canada is measured for our progress on the right to housing. And we have specific recommendations from United Nations authorities that tell us how we can do better to realize the right to housing. So, when Ambalika and I are talking about the right to housing today, we're not just talking about it as something that we write down on our posters, something that we say. We are also talking about it in the legal sense as a set of concrete standards. Okay, so where does the right to housing come from? So, important to know that Canada has signed on to a number of human rights agreements. So, the very first one that I like to point folks to is the UN Declaration on Human Rights. So, in the context of the Second World War, the world saw such tremendous atrocities. And it's important to keep in mind that human rights came to be because leaders across the country or not just across the country, across the world, realized that there was a better way forward. There was a better way for us to respect each other as humans. And with that, we saw the development of the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Now, it's important to remember in that UN declaration that civil and political rights were put on the same level as economic, social, and cultural rights. Now, what do I mean by that? Civil and political rights are things like the right to vote, like freedom of expression, like freedom of assembly, those kinds of rights that people in Canada really understand as intrinsic and protected. Economic, social, and cultural rights are rights like the right to adequate housing, they're like the right to health, the right to food, and For some reason in Canada, we have put a disproportionate amount of focus on the civil and political rights as being real rights, and then economic, social, and cultural rights as being something that are just kind of aspirational, something that are just an idea. But in fact, it's important to know that if we go back in history to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, we actually see civil and political rights and economic and social rights put at the same level of importance. And you know this even more because back in 1976, the Government of Canada ratified what's called the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, there is Article 11. Article 11 spells out specifically the right to housing. And important to know that Canada ratified this international agreement. We agreed to the right to housing as far back as 1976. Important to remember as well that and sometimes in discussions, Ambalika and I and others at NRHN hear this discourse of, well, human rights are something in the past. They've lost their relevance today. But it's very good to know that just in 2010, so about 15 years ago, Canada signed on to a new international covenant that I think is maybe very relevant for this discussion and this group, which is the International Covenant on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So that was signed just back in 2010. So, what I want you to take away from this is this idea that Canada has signed on to these international agreements. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So, what does the right to adequate housing actually require, right? And it's important to know it's not an absolute right. Just like any right, there are limitations on it. Say, for example, we look at the right to vote. The right to vote is not universal. You have to be a Canadian citizen, you have to be 18 years old. There are restrictions that are put on every right. And in the same way, the human right to housing also has parameters built around it. So, for example, there are 7 essential features of the human right to housing. So, these 7 essential features are things like legal security of tenure, so, say, protection from eviction, availability of services and material, affordability, which is a huge issue right now in Canada, habitability, which is a massive issue, particularly in the north, accessibility, key for our discussion today, location, and cultural adequacy, also a very big issue. Especially in the north. So these 7 elements of the right to housing, they give us a bit of a framework, but also good to know that there are other parts to the human right to housing. So, for example, we have these principles that we can apply. One is this idea of progressive realization. And the way that I think of progressive realization is this: progressive realization is the way that governments move forward one small step at a time. They create a national housing strategy. They create adequate affordability criteria. They make sure that there is enough social housing and public housing. They make sure that there is an adequate disability benefit, right? They're always moving forward with progressive realization, but they never take a step backward in realizing that right, because that's called retrogression, and that's a violation of human rights. Another key principle I'll note here is this idea of a maximum of available resources. This is the principle that governments must be spending a maximum of their resources on their human rights obligations. In the context of an urgent obligation, like ending homelessness, the criteria for a maximum of available resources is quite significant. And for a very wealthy nation like Canada, it's very difficult for them to argue that they don't have adequate resources to end an urgent obligation like homelessness. It also means that governments need to be creating human rights goals and timelines. So, for example, we need to see under human rights and under Canada's human rights obligations a commitment to when they will end homelessness, what their plan is to get there, and that has to be in the shortest possible amount of time. I think it's also important to remember that the right to adequate housing isn't just about these seven key elements. It's also about the way that we think about housing programs in relationship to legal protections, access to justice, making sure that tenants, for example, have access to legal representation at landlord tenant boards, and also making sure that there is a way that rights holders like you can claim the right to housing. It's also about looking at things like tax measures and how we've set up our economy to make sure that we are protecting those who are in core housing need and those who are experiencing homelessness. Okay, so a bit of background on this one international human rights system. So, folks might remember I was speaking earlier about the ways that the United Nations monitors Canada to make sure that we are adequately moving forward in the human right to housing. So, we have monitoring systems like treaty bodies where every 5 years or so, a group from the United Nations reviews Canada and gives us what's called concluding observations for us to then implement to better realize the right to housing. There is also a role called a special rapporteur, which is an expert in human rights. For example, there is a UN special rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. And it's important to remember too, as I was saying, these are legally binding obligations in international treaties. The challenge is, and I've heard this from many rights holders, what is a human right when you can't hold it? When you can't exercise it, when all you have is going to the United Nations every 5 years or so and getting these concluding observations. So, cue up what I will tell you now about the right to housing in Canada and a little bit of our story of how we got here. So back in like the early 2010s, there was a case that was launched called Tanu Jaja in Canada. And in that case, we saw individual applicants as well as one institution, now the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights. They launched a constitutional challenge saying that the government of Canada had violated the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, particularly under Section 7, life, liberty, and security of the person, and Section 15, which is on equality rights. And they had said that the government had failed to address homelessness. We did not have a national or provincial housing strategy at that point in time. There was 9,000 pages of evidence that were filed with the courts with experts, but unfortunately, after all that evidence was filed, we saw lawyers from the government file what's called a motion to strike. What that meant was that all of that evidence that was gathered, that was submitted to the courts, they asked for that not to be reviewed, and they said that the case was basically frivolous and vexatious. Unfortunately, the judge at the trial level agreed. It was appealed to the Ontario Court of Appeal, and then they agreed once more that the case would not be heard. And then was not allowed to go on to the Supreme Court of Canada because they did not grant leave for the case. And the reason I tell this story is that it's really important to see the way that governments in Canada have systemically blocked the realization of human rights for people experiencing homelessness. That case was fundamentally about homelessness and a right to life. And it's really disappointing that it did not proceed. And unfortunately, has even been interpreted in more recent cases as though that evidence had been reviewed to say that people experiencing homelessness do not have charter protections. Now, that said, advocates continued to go to treaty body reviews, work continued to be done. And then in about 2015, 2016, we got a new federal government. That new federal government started to express some openness to the human right to housing. And in about 2017, they introduced this national housing strategy, which had some housing programs in it. And then in 2019, after a major groundswell of civil society advocacy, and in fact, a draft of what that legislation could look like that was submitted to government, we then saw the tabling of the National Housing Strategy Act, which was passed in 2019. This is Canada's very first human rights law. So, what does the National Housing Strategy Act say? Well, it affirms that the right to adequate housing is a fundamental human right. And remember, this is federal legislation from our federal government in Canada. They said that it is essential to the inherent dignity and well being of the person and to building sustainable and inclusive communities. The National Housing Strategy Act, it also cites the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. You all might remember earlier, I was talking about the way that it's so important that we think about the right to housing, not just as something that we put on posters or a catchphrase that we use, but as a set of legal standards. And by citing the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and by creating ways that people can actually concretely claim these rights, we saw a major step forward in terms of access to justice and the realization of the right to housing in Canada. So, what did this legislation include? And Ambalika will speak, I think, a little bit more to this and some of the reviews that have taken place, but I will give a quick high level overview here. The way that these human rights accountability mechanisms work is that rights holders and organizations that represent them can make systemic claims to the federal housing advocate about violations of the right to adequate housing. The federal housing advocate then has the opportunity to investigate those claims, do a federal housing advocate led review, and she has the opportunity then to create recommendations in alignment with international human rights law and the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and submit those off to the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure, who is now Minister Gregor Robertson. The other very cool thing she can do is she can take those systemic claims and she can ask or require the National Housing Council to form up a review panel. A review panel is made up of 3 members of the National Housing Council, and then they hold these hearings, both written and oral. And those review panels hear from rights holders, they hear from experts. They then create recommendations that go off to the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure. And then he has a requirement to table a response to those recommendations in both the House of Commons and the Senate. So it is a way that we can hold the federal government accountable for the human right to housing beyond writing it down on our posters to this level of legal accountability, this way that really forces the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure to apply the human right to housing to Canada's laws, policies, and programs. And I believe with that I am passing the mic over to my colleague Ambalika.
Thanks, Michelle. Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning from wherever you're joining, depends on that. My name is Ambalika Roy, and as I'm already introduced as the Legal Education Coordinator for the National Right to Housing Network. So we'll start by taking a closer look at these mechanisms that Michelle just mentioned. So first, we will talk about the National Housing Council. So the National Housing Council is an advisory body that brings together people from across the country, including those with lived experience, community advocates, and housing experts to check on how the housing policies are actually working in practice in Canada. The council also advises the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure to ensure that the Canada realizes right to housing progressively, which Michelle just kind of mentioned. And what that means that the government use the maximum available resources and also respond to the needs of the most impacted people. Let's take a look at the Federal Housing Advocate, which is the next important mechanism that we will talk about. The advocate is an independent, non-partisan watchdog who can hold the governments accountable for their right to housing commitments. So currently, Mary Jose Hull is the first and current federal housing advocate who is the key driver for bringing systemic change in housing issues. And let's take a look at what the advocate is responsible for. What are her responsibilities? So she can conduct research and receive testimony about systemic housing issues. And I know we are constantly repeating this term of systemic housing issues, so we will be talking what it actually means in the later slides. They can receive testimony about systemic housing issues. They can actively engage with rights holders, with communities whose rights are violated. They can receive submissions from individuals and groups about housing rights violations, make recommendations to the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure, and speak out, of course, about housing rights violations. And finally, monitor how this entire law is progressing or how it is being implemented. So that's the role for the Federal Housing Advocate. Let's now look at the review panels, another very important mechanism under this law. So the review panels consist of 3 members of the National Housing Council who convene human rights-based hearings on systemic issues. Again, we are talking about systemic issues. I promise that we will talk about what systemic issues are in a moment. Review panels are an important oversight and accountability mechanism. The panel holds public hearings. It's a very interesting process. The panel holds public hearings and listen to people directly who are impacted, like impacted by specific housing issues, like tenants, unhoused people, or advocates, and then issues formal recommendations to the Minister of Housing, who can make recommendations within 120 days. There's a time limit for it as well. And these recommendations that we are talking about, which can be made by the review panel, helps to identify solutions that are necessary to reform and change laws, policies, and programs, and that can actually change the situation of homelessness in Canada, housing and homelessness in Canada. So we'll now take a look at the review panels, what the review panels have done so far in the couple of next slides later. And the last thing that we want to mention in this slide is also about the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure. So the minister plays another important role here because they can receive the recommendations from the Federal Housing Advocate, the National Housing Council, as well as the review panel. And their role is to respond to those recommendations. And that too, it's a time-bound recommendations. It has to be responded within 120 days through Senate and the House of Commons. So that's the role of the minister. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, here we are. So we'll start talking about what systemic issues are. So we know that many people are struggling to find a safe, affordable place to live. Rents are rising everywhere. It's no longer limited to only the urban centers. We know everywhere the rents are rising. There aren't enough affordable places for people to live. Some renters, whom you are very familiar with, whom you work with, like newcomers to Canada, who or people with low incomes face unfair treatment, are often pushed out of the housing in the communities or where they're working or where their families live. So these are issues that affect not one individual, but a communities as a whole. And also remember, they're not caused by accidents, but for faulty policies. And by faulty policies, I mean lack of stronger rental protections, treating housing as a way to make money, and many others. So all these together are called systemic housing issues, and they affect marginalized communities, as you all know probably very well, very disproportionately. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of the examples of systemic housing issues. And can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so here we are. So evictions, and especially when evictions leading to homelessness, that's definitely a systemic housing issues. And that happens because lack of access to justice or maybe inadequate rent protections. Then we have inadequate housing for indigenous, northern, rural, and remote communities, which Michèle also mentioned, that the habitability, the maintenance of those housings are in very, very bad shape. And there are a lot of shortage of affordable housing there. So that's definitely one of the systemic issues that we want to flag. Third is ableism and inaccessible housing for persons with disabilities. I think this is something that you all would be very familiar with. There are dire shortage of accessible housing units in the country, and irrespective of any cities around Canada, we know that. And we will be talking about this a little more detail in the later slides. Another one is inadequate housing for women, girls and gender diverse persons. They are not able to leave abusive relationships as many can't afford a home alone. So they choose to kind of live there because there aren't any options, affordable options for them. So that's another systemic housing issues that we want to kind of flag. Lack of social housing, I think this all of us know, and we know how incredibly the long list is, the waiting list for getting into a social housing. Uh, Financialization of housing, this is a very technical term, so we would be talking about this because this is one of the issues that the review panel has taken up, and we'll see it in a little more detail. So there are major rights gaps in Canada in the main housing document that we have, which is called the National Housing Strategy, which holds all our housing policies, programs, but actually it is unable to reduce the or rather do the job that it should be doing of reducing the core housing need or respond to the needs of the people who are most impacted. So these are few examples of systemic housing issues, and this is not an exclusive list. There could be many more, and you can also kind of try identifying the issues that you have come across in your work about what the systemic housing issues are. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. So now let's take a look at the review panels that has so far already taken place. So the first one is on financialization. So what is financialization? So this is a term which the housing world people are very, very familiar with. They kind of use it very often. So financialization of housing is referred when housing is primarily treated as a financial asset or a tool for investment, and or which helps investors to make money. And often this contributes to exponential rent hikes, poor maintenance, and sometimes obviously leads to eviction as well. So the first ever review panel heard issues of financialization in purpose-built rentals, like only the rental homes, the apartments which we have in Canada, and they are like they face severe financialization for decades now. So this review panel kind of heard the experiences from civil societies, housing and human rights experts, and even representatives of those purpose-built rentals. The panel also proposed solutions to address the issue, and over 190 submissions were received by the panel. And I think Michèle just posted the link to in the chat about this review panel. If you're interested, please take a look. So the recommendations included in incentivizing and development of new affordable rental housing, especially in the non-market sector, and actively protecting an existing affordable housing stock, which is very, very few in the country. And also the recommendations stressed on tenant protection. We might have new affordable housing kind of formed or developed, but if there are no tenant protection, it won't mean anything. So the panel stressed upon to have more tenant support and protection measures like housing subsidies, and also have a standardized tenant protections across the country, which is also very important in terms of like when we talk about tenant rights and tenant protections. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so this is the second review panel, and this is still ongoing. It's called the NEHA review panel. So the panel just finished their hearing last month, and it is looking at like the challenges, the housing challenges faced by women and gender diverse people, two-spirit people across Canada. So this review panel started with two very powerful human rights claims. And those claims were brought by the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network and the National Indigenous Housing and Homelessness Network to the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. And I think Michèle just posted the link in the chat about this review panel. It's still ongoing. The panel just finished their oral hearings, and there were over 100 submissions made to the panel. So the issue is that we know that there are lack of affordable housing, and especially this affects the housing experience of the marginalized women, gender diverse, and two-spirit people. And so many women, we know that they live on very low or low incomes and can only probably afford a maximum of $1,050 rent a month, Whereas in 2023, we know the average rent for a single room in Canada was 1450. So you can imagine which makes them very, very vulnerable and live precariously and at risk of homelessness. So that's something, the issue that we are dealing with here, and the review panel is just heard back from several people, and we are waiting for the recommendations from the panel. Maybe that will come out later this year. The recommendations will go to the minister as the process explains. Yeah. So can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so we are talking about right to housing. We are talking about the National Housing Strategy Act, but let's now understand how we can claim our right to housing, how it is just not a paper. It is still it's a claim that we can bring it to any of the forums that we are talking about. So as right to housing are human rights, and that's what in Michèle's presentation also you heard that, like how it is not just like a law which is just written, but it is actually a right which is applicable, which is practicable. So as right to housing is a human right, the government has legal obligations to act on it, maybe through courts or through the access to justice mechanism like the National Housing Strategy Act that we are talking about now. But not many people know about this. And many rights claimants feel overwhelmed or excluded by the complexity of the standard consultation process that happens. So people simply doesn't know about the review panels that I just shared with you all, or how to engage even with those process. So rights claimants sometimes even enter this entire process with a little bit of skepticism, wondering whether their input will actually lead to even a change or not. So as a first step, let's spread the word, educate communities that right to housing exists, and not just on papers, but it can also be realized. Share how rights holders can complain to the Federal Housing Advocate or a review panel, and how those mechanisms like the advocate or the review panel can make recommendations to the minister. So there is a process which is existing and we have to use it. And also, these mechanisms can only work when we engage with the rights holders, and that's the reason we are doing this webinar today, of kind of letting you all know so that you take it back that these rights exist and how we can engage with these mechanisms. So for an example, this might be very familiar with you all, and you might have seen it in your work that um, we know newcomers face discrimination in accessing housing. It's not surprising. We know it's happening for years now. Talk to them, hear their issues, document the discrimination that they face, listen about their cases, ask them how they think it can be addressed, how the discrimination can be addressed, and help them develop complaints for the advocate or the review panel if there is an opportunity. So that is what we need to do. We need to document, we need to talk to them, we need to listen to their cases. Uh, you can encourage them to even share their lived experience, which is a very, very important part of this law. And this is this because this is a very participatory law. We need to hear from the people who are actually experiencing it. So once the review panel comes up with recommendations, another thing is once the review panel comes up with the recommendations, like the panel on financialization or the current panel of women's housing issues, share the recommendations, share back the recommendations with the rights holders. Often these recommendations are not in very simple language. Simplify it and share what the recommendations is required the government to do and how that will impact them in turn. So that's something that we as community, we as people who are working with the communities who are very vulnerable, who are affected, we can do that. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so here is an opportunity that I would like to share with you all, and this is something very, very close to your work. So as many of you are working with newcomers living with disabilities, you are well aware of the accessibility challenges that persons with disabilities and seniors experience in Canada. So there are severe lack of accessible housing, which probably all of you know. I'm just reiterating that, which leads to persons with disabilities to a higher risk of homelessness. And in 2020, there were probably only 8.9 units, which were 9 housing units, which were accessible in the public housing, which is very, very less. So you can imagine how difficult it would be for a person with disability to even access a home that would be meeting their needs. So many homes come with barriers like no elevators, no ramps, inaccessible bathrooms, or not even having visible fire alarms. So many landlords even discriminate or treat them unfairly, and even sometimes uh, a lack of housing, due to lack of accessible housing that meet a person's needs, they are forced to live in institutions away from their communities and families. So these are all challenges due to the lack of accessible housing. So we probably are aware of it. So now here is where the opportunity lies. So last month, the Federal Housing Advocate has requested to form a review panel to take a look at the situation of lack of accessible housing. And soon you can make submissions, sharing experiences of persons with disabilities, and what they face while they are looking for a home that meet their needs. So this is our chance to voice our concerns. The review panel has not yet opened, but this is a request has gone from the Federal Housing Advocate to the review panel, the National Housing Council. And soon you would probably hear about the review panel opening, where you come in and you can share your feedback, share your concerns, and also make submissions. Can I have the next slide? So this brings me to the last part of my presentation and the last slide. How can you get involved? So as this panel opens, as this review panel starts, uh, collect information on systemic issues that you see, the challenges that you see in securing an accessible home that the newcomers are facing, or even hear from the lived experts. Document. It's very important to document their experiences. Ask them what they need and what they think could be a solution, because this is all about co-creating solution. The solution should come from the people who are affected. So if it's possible, identify how it violates Canada's international obligations. And by that, I mean the first part of the presentation, which Michèle shared about the Canada's commitment about the international law and also the National Housing Strategy Act. So if you can identify, the violations, it's very important to know that. And of course, we are here to support you as well in looking at those violations. And finally, when the review panel opens, make your own submissions as an organization, as an advocate, or even as a lived expert. So that's our opportunity there, and we must use it so that this law actually functions. Okay, can I have the last slide, please? Okay, that's all we had to share with you today. Of course, we would be taking some questions, and that would come through the chat. These are our contact numbers and contact email IDs. Please feel free to sign into our newsletter, and also take a look at our website. We have a lot of resources which might be helpful. And also, we would be sharing resources that we mentioned here in the chat in our next newsletter. So please sign up for it if you are able to, or you're interested. So you would be up to date about the knowledge about this review panels, upcoming review panels. Thank you so much for your time. And I think now, Tekla, you have a poll for the participants, and I'll just pass it over to Tekla. Thank you so much for your time and listening to us.
Okay, so we'll have the questions going on as we do the poll, and we have a question also already posted in the Q&A, Ambalika. Michèle or Ambalika, you can see it?
Yes, I see the poll. Would you like us, Tekla, to answer the one question in the Q&A while
Yes.
folks are filling out the poll? Okay, great. And Balika, I saw the question while you were speaking, so do you want me to jump right in? Yeah. Okay. There's a really excellent question in here. And it is, can a shelter evict a vulnerable client who cannot pay for rent after some time has passed in the shelter? This is such an excellent question, and I actually have a really good resource for you. So we did a project not long ago. In fact, we just released this last year, and they were national shelter standards in alignment with the human right to housing and also in alignment with the gender-based approach. We did some work. We worked with rights holders. We worked with folks who were running shelters. We worked with folks all across the sector to say, okay, what are human rights standards that we can all agree upon for shelters? And one of the big issues that was identified for us through this process is, what do you do when, when can you evict someone from a shelter? Especially knowing how rampant the homelessness crisis is, and knowing that when you're evicting someone from a shelter, you're evicting into homelessness. And under international human rights law, you actually can't evict into homelessness unless it is a pretty dire circumstance. So we worked really closely with some shelter providers to develop, and I'll put in the shelter standards right here if folks want to take a look at that right here. And actually, we have this document available in French as well, so I'll make sure that the French is posted as well, and hopefully that helps answer your question. It is not an easy yes or no question. It depends, on the shelter, but the idea under international human rights law is that there should not be an eviction into homelessness unless alternatives are explored. And Balika, did you have anything else to add to that answer?
No, I think you covered it all. Thank you.
Okay.
I can't see any other questions, Michelle. Is anything else?
Yes, I see one. You know what? Where you see them, Ambalika? If you go to the Q&A box there, I see a couple of other questions, and I can even read to you. Are there opportunities for the philanthropic sector to support the right to housing through grants, investments, and other mechanisms? What an excellent question. This was voiced by Carolyn Lavoie, I believe. I can answer that question as well, Ambalika, if you would like me to do so. And I don't see Ambalika, and I'm slightly worried that she's not in here anymore. But okay, I'm going to go ahead and answer that question.
Please go ahead, Michelle.
Oh, good. I do see you. Okay. Oh gosh, the fun of Zoom, eh? Are there opportunities for the philanthropic sector? Absolutely. And interestingly, I would also say that the right to housing sector is one that has not been well funded. It is very easy to convince folks in the philanthropic sector to invest in housing because it's so tangible, right? Like to build a unit that supports people experiencing homelessness or in core housing need. But there actually isn't very much funding in tackling the systemic violations of the right to housing that exist, or there isn't much funding in working with clients, with rights holders to bring forward these systemic violations and then negotiate to work with government to find those policy solutions. So I would say there is a major, major role for the philanthropic sector to step in here. I can very happily put in my email in the chat, and I would be so happy, Carolyn, to talk about this further.
And also, it's an evolving sector. It's a very, very new sector.
Yes.
So, if there and the need is growing every day, is what I would say. So there could be a lot of innovative approaches that we can actually work. And definitely, as Michelle said, that there's a huge need of the grants and the funds so that the sector actually works the way it should be and meet the needs of the people.
I see as well, Ambalika, we have a couple of other questions that are coming in. Just to pick up on these, I see another follow-up question about the shelter, which is, can a shelter refuse a person if their legal situation in Canada is not clear? For example, if a client is homeless and he is a visitor, so for example, having visitor status, that is a great question. I would assume that you would need to look at the individual human rights code within that province or territory to be able to determine how that would play out. And Balika, do you have any thoughts on that?
Uh, in the international situation, of course, I mean, nobody should be like let alone into homelessness, even if the shelter should not be denied. But obviously, the shelters are managed in different provinces. There are provincial guidelines, there are different rules. So I think that's something an important fact. But there has been a lot of advocacy which has happened, and especially if you're in Toronto, you would know this. I think a couple of summers back, there has been a huge issue where there were a lot of international, there were refugees who were refused in shelters, and there had been a huge advocacy from community to have them there, and it was summer, if I'm not mistaken. So that did work well. There was a lot of other options which was provided, but at the same time, the city finally had to take back the notification that was there for not having enough, not allowing the refugees in the shelter. So there is a possibility of advocacy, but yes, I mean, under the international framework, nobody should be led into homelessness or evictions until another opportunity is provided or any other place to live in is provided. So that's very clear, but how that operates, it definitely depends on the shelter guidelines and the provincial laws that we have.
That is such a great point, Ambalika. The other piece I was thinking of as well that we can flag for folks is that just like there are these federal mechanisms, there is also a mechanism at the level of the city of Toronto to claim the right to housing. There's a role of a Toronto housing ombudsperson. And if I'm not mistaken, and Ambalika, you would know this so much better than I would, but they did their very first review, in fact, on refugee access to shelter. So that might be something that is of great interest to folks, and we can even post in a link, or if folks want to follow our newsletter, the link is in there. We can make sure that that in our next newsletter we include the link to that resource. And Balika, I also see a note here. There is another question here. How are language barriers and linguistic discrimination, specifically for official language minority communities, such as Francophones outside of Quebec, considered when assessing systemic housing issues? And Balika, did you want to take a run at this one, or do you want me to?
That's a great question, actually, in effect. And now I can see the questions. Unfortunately, I was not able to see any of the questions earlier. Um, I think it's a language barrier is one of the critical issues that while we were working around the shelter standards, Michelle, that we kind of found that in our research as well, because a lot of times people who are not speaking even in terms of not speaking English or French, even we have seen how, especially for women who are accessing shelters, so the language barriers added a layer of another disproportionately that was affecting their right to access to shelter. So it is indeed a very critical point that has been raised, and especially for somebody who is not francophone, I think the challenge is I mean, you cannot be denied based on the linguistic the language that you know is what I would say as a person who is working into human rights issues. But of course, there are interpretations available that should be the case. At least that is what we, even when we developed the shelter standards, that was one of the recommendations that we kind of put forward, to have the linguistic like the opportunity for having different languages. Even the shelter the person seeking the shelter should be kind of provided. But is there any special rule, particularly in Quebec, outside Quebec? I'm not sure, but there might be some special shelters, but I'm not really aware of that. But Michèle, if you want to kind of add in or something that you might be useful in this regard.
I don't think I have anything else to add to your answer, Ambalika, but just to support the point that I think, I think that a piece around language barriers and discrimination as a form of a systemic violation of the right to housing. I think about as well for francophones outside of Quebec, say, applying for a rental unit when applications aren't available in both official languages. Those kinds of pieces could absolutely be part of a claim to the federal housing advocate around the issue of language and violations of the right to housing. It's a great question.
I also see a question around the institutionalization and how people are separated. So the question is, I heard Ambalika talk about people who are institutionalized and separated from their community. We hear a lot of accessibility in housing, but much less about inclusive housing. Can you speak to the right of inclusive housing and how we can integrate this into our submissions to Federal Housing Advocate, the review panel, and the Canada's international obligations? It's a great question. There is a model case actually which happened in Nova Scotia, and we can share some of the documents from there. So that was, if I'm not mistaken, and if I'm saying something wrong, Michèle, do correct me there. This case was, I think it is a 2020, 2021 around case. And this was about a human rights tribunal decision that happened in Nova Scotia by a person who was institutionalized because there wasn't any home available to that person's need. The needs that a person required in an accessible home, that was not available, and that's a reason, even though involuntarily that person had to be living in an institution for years. And finally, when the case was happening for quite some time, if I'm not mistaken, and then finally the Human Rights Commission actually ruled in her favor. There was a compensation, if I'm not mistaken, and also that it told the province to create systems and mechanisms so that individuals, persons with disabilities or any special needs, there should be housing available for them, for their needs, and it should be monitored from time to time. So there has been like the progressive realization that we spoke about, like how it should be progressively realized. The province should have enough resources, should be spent around homes, accessible homes. So that's really a model case, and on that case, that could be built on a lot around that. I think, I mean, if you're interested, we can just while we are talking, we can just post some links around that case. So there has been a lot of buzz, and it was a very positive decision. It took years, but finally, I think it was a Disability Rights Coalition case, if I'm not mistaken, in Nova Scotia, with the lived experience of the people who were actually institutionalized. So there has been instances and precedents available. So we can definitely take a look at that and look at the recommendations of the Human Rights Commission there and use that for the submissions that you plan to do for the Federal Housing Advocate. And Michèle, please feel free to add if I have missed something.
I'll just add one quick note, which is that on that case you're speaking about, one of the really beautiful things that happened is we saw a really good example of a human rights remedy where, it's interesting. So the litigation took place, and what the judge awarded was that the province, so in this case Nova Scotia, had to come back and appear before the court with a plan of how they would be progressively meeting the needs of persons with disabilities in institutionalized settings, and particularly making it so that community benefits that they were receiving were adequate. And part of that was that the government had to work with the rights holders in that case. It's a really good example of the way that courts can intervene to create a remedy that comes out of a court case that's in line with human rights. I'm going to note, I see some other beautiful questions in here. I would love to take the time to go through them all, but I am also conscious that we are at time.
Michèle, sorry.
Yes.
Zenadina has her hand up.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Zinadine, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, sure. Thank you guys to give me the the opportunity to speak right now. I just heard a question, like a question and then your answer about the Francophone support that is provided in the community. As a social worker, as a housing case manager for Center Francophone of the GTA, I can give you maybe some details about that I know. There is some, first of all, if we speak about the shelters themselves, they did a great job, and now they have more French support to help those clients who speak French. Also, there is also um, some other institutions that provide help with the housing. One of the example is probably one of the most famous, which is the center in French, Centre d'aide héritage. It's a transitional housing for those seniors people. And by the way, like there's other projects that are on how to say that in English. Yeah, you understand what I'm saying, right? So we progress in this direction, and yeah. So that's pretty much everything.
So because we are short of time, Michèle and Ambalika, and there are so many questions in the chat, I'm just wondering if the people who are asking these questions can get in touch with us and then respond to them directly, or if you have time, they can like stay behind and then like respond to them. I don't know the way to go.
Well,
Let me.
you know
Mhm.
what I might suggest we do? These are such excellent questions. Why don't I suggest, just because I know I also know that the interpreters, I'm sure, need a break too, but why don't I suggest that Ambalika and I can post in our emails into the chat, and we can make sure to circulate a number of resources to folks afterwards. And then if folks want to touch base with us by email afterwards with their questions, that might be the best way to go. I do want to take a quick moment and just plug that if folks are interested in taking an immediate action around the right to housing, we do have a campaign going on right now. So I do want to flag this for folks. Ambalika talked a little bit about the financialization of housing. We've been working on a campaign with about 20 organizations and individuals around financialization and calling on Prime Minister Mark Carney to take some concrete steps to protect renters and people experiencing homelessness. So I've popped in the link there for folks. That's the campaign to fight against the financialization of housing. And I invite folks to put in their information to send an open letter, to participate in sending a letter. And as Ambalika and I have noted, I think we've got our newsletter as well. I really want to encourage folks to sign up for our newsletter, where we will also be distributing the link that OCASI will put on their YouTube channel. And perhaps Ambalika, in our next newsletter as well, we can include links to a bunch of the resources that we've talked about in this Q&A, like the shelter standards. We also have a webinar on that case in Nova Scotia Ambalika was speaking to. So we can include a list of some of those resources if folks would like to sign up for our newsletter.
Yeah. So just also to follow up on that, anyone with those questions, and if you don't, in case you don't reach out to Michèle, you can still reach out to our email for Tekla or Silvana, and then we will forward those concerns or those who are interested in the review panel, and then they will be sorted out by Michèle and Ambalika. So let's close at that point, and then we can follow up with more emails.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, everyone who joined.
Thank you very much,
Okay.
Thank you very
Michèle,
much.
Ambalika, and all our interpreters. Thank you.
Thank you
And
so
the
much.
attendees too.
Okay, thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.